They told us humans were weak. Not in whispers, not in speculation. It was doctrine, etched into coalition archives, repeated in military briefings, accepted without question. A species cataloged under biological inefficiency. Fragile skeletal structure, limited muscular output, no natural armor, no claws, no venom, no evolutionary advantage worth noting. A statistical anomaly that survived by accident. I believed it. We all did. I am Kareth of the Voran ascendancy, born under crushing gravity, forged in pressure that would collapse lesser beings into pulp. My kind does not question strength. We measure it, we embody it, and we dominate through it. So when the humans were admitted into the Coalition's military exchange program, we did not prepare for competition. We prepared for entertainment. The outpost orbited a world so dense its gravity distorted the very light around it. Even in controlled conditions, the station maintained a baseline pressure that would cripple most species. It was a proving ground where only the strongest endured. And on that cycle, something unexpected arrived. The human shuttle was unremarkable. No war markings, no reinforced hull. It drifted into the docking bay with none of the aggressive precision typical of warrior species, just a smooth, almost casual approach. The bay doors opened, and he stepped out. At first, I thought there had been an error. He was smaller than expected, not significantly, but enough to be noticeable among giants. No exoskeleton, no visible augmentations, no biological weapons, just soft skin, minimal armor, and a posture that lacked any sign of readiness. Around me, the others reacted as predicted. A Kravex warbeast emitted a low, amused growl, its plated limbs shifting with anticipation. A trio of Salathi exchanged clicks of mockery, their multi-jointed frames towering above the newcomer. Even my own squad allowed themselves subtle gestures of dismissal. This was the human? This fragile thing? I studied him closely, expecting the usual signs: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, the instinctual tension of prey surrounded by predators. But I found none. His movements were controlled, deliberate. His gaze moved not erratically, not nervously, but with purpose. He observed everything, every exit, every soldier, every weapon. Not like prey, like a strategist. That was the first moment something felt wrong. "Recruit," one of the instructors called, its voice amplified across the chamber. The human's head turned toward the source of authority. No hesitation, no delay. "Corporal Elias Vance," he said. His voice carried clearly, despite the pressure-dampened air. Not loud, not aggressive. Steady. The instructor paused, just for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But I noticed. "Species classification, human," the instructor continued. "You have been assigned to adaptation training." A ripple of amusement passed through the gathered soldiers.
We all knew what that meant. Adaptation training on this outpost was not evaluation. It was elimination. The human inclined his head slightly. No protest. No concern. Just acceptance. That was the second moment something felt wrong. We were ordered to assemble in the gravity chamber, a reinforced environment capable of simulating extreme gravitational fields. It was a place where even elite warriors were tested to their limits. As we entered, the pressure was already higher than standard. My muscles adjusted automatically, compensating as they had since my earliest training cycles. Around me, others did the same, their bodies responding with practiced efficiency. The human walked in last. No visible strain. No hesitation. Just that same measured pace. The chamber sealed behind us with a resonant thrum. Lights dimmed. Systems activated. "Baseline gravity increasing," the instructor announced. The shift was immediate. Weight pressed down from all directions, an invisible force tightening its grip. The floor seemed to rise against us, demanding resistance. I felt it settle into my bones, familiar and welcome. Around me, others did the same, their bodies responding with practiced efficiency. The human walked in last. No visible strain. No hesitation. Just that same measured pace. The chamber sealed behind us with a resonant thrum. Lights dimmed. Systems activated. Baseline gravity increasing, the instructor announced. The shift was immediate. Weight pressed down from all directions, an invisible force tightening its grip. The floor seemed to rise against us, demanding resistance. I felt it settle into my bones, familiar and welcome. Around me, others did the same, their bodies responding with practiced efficiency. The human walked in last. No visible strain. No hesitation. Just that same measured pace. The chamber sealed behind us with a resonant thrum. Light systems activated. Baseline gravity increasing, the instructor announced. The shift was immediate. Weight pressed down from all directions, an invisible force tightening its grip. The floor seemed to rise against us, demanding resistance. I felt it settle into my bones, familiar and welcome. Around me, others did the same, their bodies responding with practiced efficiency. The human walked in last. No visible strain. No hesitation. 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 No.
Unafraid. In that moment, the entire chamber seemed to shift, not physically, but conceptually, because the weakest being in the room was the only one not afraid. And for the first time since his arrival, I felt it. Not confusion, not curiosity, something deeper, something colder. Because if the human was not afraid of this, then what, in all the known systems, was he actually afraid of? What would happen when the pressure increased further? The pressure did not stop. That was the first realization, the most dangerous one. Gravity in controlled environments follows predictable limits. There are thresholds, safety protocols, calculated ceilings designed to preserve life, even in the harshest training simulations. This chamber was exceeding them. The instructor's voice remained calm, but I detected it, the subtle distortion in tone, the fractional delay between system readout and vocalization. Even they had not planned for this escalation. The weight increased again. It did not press. It crushed. My legs trembled beneath me, dense muscle fibers straining as they fought to maintain structural integrity. The floor felt closer now, as if the universe itself sought to fold me into it. Around me, the chamber echoed with the sounds of stress, armor plating, grinding, joints locking, breath turning ragged. A Cravex collapsed fully, its massive frame slamming into the reinforced floor with a force that reverberated through my own bones. A Salathi beside me let out a sharp, involuntary shriek as two of its limbs gave way, folding unnaturally beneath the pressure. This was no longer a test. This was failure, unfolding in real time. He was still standing. The human, Corporal Elias Vance. At first, I searched for signs of hidden assistance, gravitic dampeners, external support fields, unauthorized augmentation. There had to be an explanation. There is always an explanation. But there was nothing. Only biology. Only control. His posture had changed, subtly, but undeniably. His feet were no longer parallel. One had shifted half a unit backward, redistributing his center of mass. His knees were slightly bent now, not in weakness, but in preparation. His spine aligned with unnatural precision, forming a perfect channel through which the force could travel without breaking him. And his breathing, it was synchronized. Each inhale timed with the rise of pressure. Each exhale controlled, measured, releasing tension before it could accumulate into failure. He was not resisting the gravity.
He was flowing with it. That was the moment understanding began to fracture. "Impossible," one of the fallen soldiers rasped, its voice distorted against the floor. "Yes, impossible. Humans evolved on a low-gravity world. Their physiology should not support this level of stress. Their bones should fracture, their muscles should tear, their organs should begin to fail under internal compression. That is what the data said. That is what we believed." The chamber screamed.
Not metaphorically, physically. The reinforced walls emitted a low, continuous groan as the structural integrity system struggled to compensate. Warning lights flickered across the upper panels, casting erratic shadows across the broken forms of soldiers who could no longer move. I felt it then. True strain. My legs buckled, only slightly, but enough to force a recalibration. I lowered my stance, every instinct screaming to conserve energy, to survive the load rather than challenge it. Around me, there was no formation anymore, only survival, only endurance, and in the center of it all, the human moved. Not much, not dramatically, but enough. He adjusted his shoulders, rolling them once as if shedding invisible weight, his neck tilted, releasing tension. His arms hung loose, not rigid, not locked, but ready. Efficient. Every motion had purpose. Every adjustment prevented collapse before it could begin. No wasted energy, no panic, only adaptation. Whispers turned into fragmented sounds, disbelief no longer contained, spreading through the chamber like a contagion. He should be down. This level, no species. System malfunction. This isn't. But it was. I watched him, and for the first time in my existence, I questioned the foundation of strength itself. Because what I was witnessing was not endurance. It was mastery. The instructor hesitated before announcing it. That hesitation confirmed everything. This was beyond protocol, beyond safety, beyond reason. Alarms began to flicker, not fully engaged yet, but warning systems activating in layers, preparing for catastrophic override. A second Cravex collapsed, then another. A towering insectoid species beside me lost all structural cohesion, its limbs folding inward as it crumpled to the ground in a twitching mass. Even I felt my balance slipping. My vision narrowed slightly, peripheral awareness dimming under the strain. My muscles screamed, micro tears forming as they fought to sustain output beyond designed capacity. This was the breaking point, for all of us. Except him. The human's head lifted, slowly, deliberately. And for the first time since the trial began, he looked directly at the instructor, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling: assessment. As if he were no longer the subject of the test, but the observer. The chamber fell silent, not because the pressure ceased, but because no one had the capacity to make sound anymore. 5.0, that was not a training parameter, that was a termination threshold. My body reacted instinctively, one knee slamming into the floor as my systems diverted all remaining energy into preventing full collapse. My vision blurred at the edges, internal pressure building to dangerous levels. Around me, there was nothing but fallen giants, warriors, elites, beings who had conquered worlds, reduced to stillness, helpless under an invisible force. And in the center, the human finally moved, but not in the way we expected.
He did not fall. He did not falter. He exhaled.
For adaptation, and there he was, standing, unmoved, at the center of it all. The human, Corporal Elias Vance. The distortion bent around him, not perfectly, not completely, but enough.
The crushing vectors that tore the rest of us apart seemed redirected in his presence, managed, distributed. He was not untouched by the force. He was navigating it, like a being who understood the rules, because he had written them. He took a step forward, slowly, deliberately. His foot met the ground with controlled pressure, adjusting mid-motion as the gravitational vector beneath it shifted. His body followed, not resisting the change, but compensating for it before failure could occur. Another step, then another, each movement precise, efficient, economical. There was no struggle in him, only calculation. The device on his wrist emitted a low, steady hum, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably the source of this impossibility. Later, we would learn its designation, human gravity band. But in that moment, it was something far more terrifying. It was proof that strength was no longer the dominant variable. Because the human was not stronger than us, that much was still true. His muscles were smaller, his mass was lower, his raw output, by every measurable standard, was inferior. And yet, he was the only one standing. Understanding struck me with brutal clarity. He had not increased his strength. He had decreased the relevance of ours. Another soldier attempted to rise, a towering, multi-limbed veteran whose species had evolved under conditions near stellar collapse. It pushed against the shifting forces, muscles bulging, armor grinding, and was immediately slammed back down as the vector beneath it inverted. A futile effort. Strength applied in the wrong direction is not strength. It is vulnerability. The human continued walking, not hurried, not aggressive, just inevitable. The chamber around him had become a battlefield, but not one defined by weapons or physical dominance. It was defined by variables.
And he controlled them, a voice shouted from the control deck above. For a moment, hope flickered. The response came almost instantly, edged with something I had never heard from a coalition officer before. Panic. We can't, the system's not accepting. Their voices overlapped, fractured, lost in the growing chaos. Because the truth was already evident. They were no longer in control. The system was not malfunctioning. It was being overridden by a single device, by a single human. I felt the force shift again, my body dragged sideways, my shoulder slamming into the floor with enough pressure to fracture lesser bone structures. My vision blurred, internal systems struggling to maintain coherence under the inconsistent load. And still, he walked. Step by step, he moved through the fallen, past warriors who had once towered over him, past beings who had defined strength by mass, by power, by dominance, now reduced to motionless forms beneath a force they could not comprehend. He stopped at the center of the chamber, exactly where the gravitational distortion was most intense, where no being should have been able to stand. And yet, he did. Slowly, he lifted his head. His gaze moved across us, not with contempt, not with superiority, but with understanding, as if he had expected this outcome from the very beginning. The device on his wrist pulsed once more, stabilizing slightly around him. Not removing the chaos, just making it manageable. For him, I realized then, this was not a weapon in the way we understood weapons. It did not destroy. It did not attack. It redefined the environment in which conflict occurred. And in doing so, it made every advantage we possessed irrelevant. The human looked down at us, at me, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the distorted chamber with impossible clarity. Calm, measured, certain. Gravity isn't your advantage, he said. A pause, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. Silence followed, not because the chamber was quiet. Far from it. The system still groaned, the forces still shifted, the fallen still struggled in vain. But because, in that moment, nothing else mattered. Everything we believed about strength, about superiority, about dominance, collapsed under the weight of a single realization. We had been measuring power incorrectly, for cycles beyond counting. And the weakest species in the coalition had just proven it. The device emitted one final pulse,
The gravitational chaos intensified, just slightly, just enough, to remind us all that this demonstration was not the limit of its capability, only a fraction, only a glimpse. The human remained still at the center, unaffected, unchallenged, in control. And as my vision dimmed under the strain, one final thought forced its way through the collapsing edges of my consciousness. If this was what a single human could do, with a device designed for training, then what would happen when they decided to use it for war?
Because the most terrifying realization was not what we had just witnessed, it was what it implied. What happens when the weakest species removes everyone else's advantage? Silence did not come when the chaos ended. It lingered, heavy, suffocating, long after the force itself had vanished. I remember the exact moment the distortion stopped. The human lowered his wrist, a single, deliberate motion. The device emitted a soft chime, almost gentle in contrast to the devastation it had unleashed. And then, gravity returned. Not gradually, not mercifully, instantly. The crushing, shifting vectors collapsed into a singular, stable force, downward, predictable, familiar. For most beings, that should have been relief. For us, it was something else entirely. My body hit the floor fully. Not because the weight increased, but because my muscles, strained beyond their limits, no longer trusted reality enough to respond. I lay there, every fiber trembling, struggling to reconcile the sudden absence of chaos. Around me, the chamber was filled with broken forms, elite soldiers, warriors who had endured conditions that would annihilate entire civilizations, now unable to rise. Some did not move at all, locked in place, their nervous systems overwhelmed. Others attempted to push themselves upward, only to collapse again as their bodies failed to respond correctly to stable gravity after enduring its unpredictable counterpart. It was not just physical damage, it was something deeper, something structural. Our understanding of force had been violated, and our bodies did not yet know how to exist without that violation. Medical drones flooded the chamber within seconds. Sleek, multi-armed constructs descended from the upper panels, their sensors scanning rapidly, identifying fractures, internal trauma, neurological disruption. Beams of stabilizing energy flickered across the fallen, lifting some just enough to prevent further injury. Orders echoed from above. I recognized that last one. It was directed at me. A drone hovered into position, projecting a containment field around my body. The pressure adjusted, subtle, controlled, allowing my internal systems to stabilize without collapse. I drew a breath, then another. Each one felt uncertain, as if the simple act of breathing required recalibration. I turned my head, slowly, painfully, and I saw him, the human, standing, unharmed, unshaken. The device on his wrist was inactive now, its faint glow extinguished. There was no visible sign that it had ever been engaged, no residual energy, no distortion, nothing to indicate that moments ago it had rewritten the laws of the chamber. He stepped back from the center, not hurried, not defensive, just done, as if the event had concluded exactly as intended. Two instructors descended from the control platform, their movements sharp, controlled, but I detected it again. That hesitation, that fracture in certainty.
One of them called, voice amplified but lacking its previous authority. You will explain your actions immediately. The use of unauthorized equipment during a controlled trial is a direct violation of... It wasn't unauthorized, the human replied. He did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt. He simply spoke. And the instructor stopped. Not because they were silenced by force, but because for a moment, they did not know how to respond. The human lifted his wrist slightly, just enough for the device to be visible. "It's standard issue," he continued. A pause. The words were simple, uncomplicated. But their impact, it spread through the chamber faster than any alarm. Training? This was training? Not a weapon deployment. Not a last resort measure. Not an act of desperation. Routine. Designed. Expected. I felt something shift within me. Not physically, but conceptually. This had not been an anomaly. This had not been a fluke. This was method. The instructors exchanged a glance, brief but heavy with unspoken calculation. Regardless of classification, the lead instructor said, regaining a measure of composure, your actions disrupted a controlled evaluation and resulted in widespread incapacitation of coalition personnel. Was it a failure? The human asked. Again, no aggression, no challenge, just a question. The instructor's voice faltered. Because the answer was not simple. Was it a failure? The chamber had been compromised. The soldiers had been incapacitated. Protocol had been broken. And yet, what we had witnessed was undeniable. The human lowered his wrist fully, the device now nothing more than inert metal against his skin. "You wanted to test adaptation," he said. No arrogance, no pride, just fact. The instructor did not respond immediately. For the first time since I had known their kind, they looked uncertain. Not about procedure, about understanding. Medical drones continued their work, lifting bodies, stabilizing systems, restoring function where possible. Slowly, the chamber began to recover. Not to its previous state, but to something quieter, something more cautious. Whispers began again. But they were different now. No longer amused. No longer dismissive. They carried weight. A single human. Entire squad. Incapacitated. No direct attack. Environmental override.
Instead, he moved to the side of the chamber and stood still, his gaze distant, focused on something beyond us. Analyzing, reviewing, learning. As if the event we struggled to comprehend was simply data to him. Microfractures appeared along the subject's skeletal structure, clearly visible in the diagnostic overlay. Internal stress indicators spiked into dangerous ranges. Any rational species would have terminated the session. This human continued until failure. Not collapse, not death. Failure defined by their own parameters. The moment the body could no longer respond with controlled efficiency, the session ended. Not before. Never before. The recording cut. I sat in silence for several moments, processing. Then I opened another file, and another, and another. Each one revealed a different environment. Extreme heat chambers, temperatures rising to levels that would liquefy lesser species. Humans enduring, adapting, learning how their bodies responded to thermal stress. Vacuum simulations, controlled exposure to near-zero pressure, forcing rapid adaptation protocols for survival in hostile environments. Isolation trials, extended periods of sensory deprivation, where the only enemy was the mind itself. In every scenario, the pattern remained consistent. Humans did not avoid adversity. They engineered it. They isolated variables. They pushed themselves to the edge of failure, and then documented the result. Pain was not treated as a warning. It was treated as information. Weakness was not hidden. It was identified, targeted, eliminated. One log in particular forced me to stop again. I accessed it. The chamber resembled the one I had witnessed, but smaller, more controlled. A human stood within it, wearing the device. The same device. The gravity band. The system activated, but instead of uniform pressure, the gravitational field began shifting, unstable, chaotic, identical to what we had experienced. The human stumbled at first, collapsed, failed. The session ended, then restarted. Again, and again, and again. Dozens of attempts, each one slightly different, each one analyzed. The human adjusted with every iteration, changing stance, modifying movement patterns, refining breathing techniques, learning not how to resist the environment, but how to predict it, to anticipate instability before it occurred, to move in harmony with forces that should have been impossible to control. By the final recording, the human was walking, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but successfully, controlled within chaos, exactly as Elias Vance had done. I leaned back from the interface. For the first time since beginning my investigation, I felt something close to unease, because the implication was no longer theoretical. The gravity band was not a weapon, not in its intended design. It was a training tool, a system created not to defeat enemies, but to force adaptation under impossible conditions, which meant what we had witnessed in the chamber was not a demonstration of peak human capability. It was a demonstration of familiarity, routine, expected outcome. I accessed additional logs, cross-referencing equipment ossifications across human military divisions.
The results were consistent. Gravity bands, standard issue in multiple units, variants designed for different environments, different stress thresholds, different applications, all centered around one concept: control through adaptation. My earlier assumptions began to fracture, not because they were entirely wrong, but because they were based on incomplete understanding. Humans were not physically dominant. That remained true. But physical dominance was not their objective. It never had been. They did not seek to become the strongest. They sought to become the most adaptable, and in doing so, they rendered strength secondary. I closed the archive. The silence that followed felt heavier than any gravity field, because the truth was no longer hidden. It had been there all along, buried beneath data we had failed to interpret correctly. We had measured humans by their limits, by what they could not do. But humans They do not define themselves by limitation. They define themselves by progression, by what they are not yet, but will become. And that distinction changes everything. I thought back to the chamber, to Elias Vance standing at the center of controlled chaos, unshaken, unmatched. Not because he was stronger, but because he had already faced that environment countless times before, in training, in preparation, by choice. A realization formed, slow, deliberate, unavoidable. We had not underestimated humanity. Not exactly. We had done something far worse. We had misunderstood them entirely. And misunderstanding a species like that is far more dangerous than underestimation it. Because underestimation can be corrected. Misunderstanding leads to flawed strategy. And flawed strategy leads to extinction. I rose from the archive terminal, my thoughts no longer aligned with the doctrines I had followed for cycles. Everything had shifted. Everything had changed. Because if humans train this way, if they prepare for environments beyond reason, if they treat pain as data and failure as progression, then there is only one logical conclusion, one question that cannot be ignored. What if humans are not the weakest species in the coalition, but the most dangerous kind of adaptable? The summons came without warning. No public announcement, no procedural briefing, no standard rotation alert. Only a sealed transmission marked with highest tier clearance, priority above all ongoing operations. When I entered the restricted chamber, I immediately sensed the change. It was not physical. It was psychological. The air felt heavier, not with gravity, but with implication. Conversations were absent. Even movement was restrained, as though every being present understood that something irreversible had already occurred. At the center stood Instructor Varro, the same figure who only cycles ago had dismissed the human with calm amusement. Now, he did not begin with authority. He began with silence. His gaze moved across the assembled officers, slowly, deliberately, as if confirming something none of us yet understood. His expression tightened slightly. No one spoke. We were not permitted to. Varro raised a hand, activating the central holo display. The chamber darkened. Light coalesced into data streams. Human classification files appeared first. Standard biological profiles, weak musculature, low baseline strength, limited natural defenses, predictable environmental dependency. The familiar narrative, the one we all believed. Then the display shifted. Radiation zone records, vacuum exposure simulations, thermal collapse environments. Varro's voice returned, quieter now. Another pause. The hologram expanded. A devastated planetary surface under constant radiation storms. Species logs indicated full ecological collapse within cycles. Then, movement. Human units operating within the storm. Not reacting, not struggling, operating. Structured formations, coordinating movement, environmental adaptation protocols engaged in real time. I felt something uncomfortable form in my chest. Not fear yet, but its outline. Varro continued. He turned slightly, as if choosing his words with precision. A ripple moved through the room, subtle, unspoken, dangerous. The display shifted again. Heat variant zones, pressure collapse fields, cryogenic instability regions. Each system showed the same pattern. Initial failure, rapid recalibration, controlled adaptation. Survival not as accident, but as method. Varro stepped closer to the hologram. This is not conventional biological adaptation, he said. He highlighted segments of human neural response data, cognitive overlays, physiological synchronization patterns, external device interaction logs. Humans do not separate systems, he continued. A pause. Body,
Mind. Machine. My thoughts drifted involuntarily back to the gravity chamber, to Elias Vance standing calmly in impossible conditions, not resisting the environment, but negotiating with it. Varro's voice sharpened slightly. The gravity band appeared in the hologram, the same device, simple, compact, unassuming. A few officers shifted uneasily. Varro noticed. Silence deepened. He let the words settle. The hologram shifted again. Live training logs. Human subjects exposed to fluctuating gravitational fields. Not once. Repeatedly. Failures recorded. Adjustments logged. Iterations refined. Each failure is not rejection, Varro said. I felt the realization begin to tighten. Cold. Precise. Unavoidable. Humans were not surviving these conditions. They were learning them. Varro turned to face us fully now. The display zoomed into a single training cycle, a human collapsing under extreme stress. System reset. Retry. Adjustment. Collapse again. Retry. Again. And again. Humans do not fear failure, he said. My mind attempted to reject the implication, but the data did not allow it.
Because every iteration showed the same outcome: improvement. Not linear, exponential. Varro deactivated the display briefly. The chamber returned to dim light. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. Not instructional, reflective. That sentence landed heavier than anything before it. Designing itself. Not evolution as passive adaptation, but evolution as deliberate construction. Varro activated one final file. Red classified. No designation. Only footage. Human units operating in environments no coalition species had survived for more than minutes. Yet they moved through it. Coordinated. Functional. Stable. Not because the environment was survivable, but because instability had become expected. Adapted into baseline behavior. Varro's voice lowered. He turned slightly. Another pause. The hologram faded. The room remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. Because everything we had understood about dominance, power, and biological hierarchy had been redefined in a single briefing. Varro looked at us one final time, and there was something in his expression I had never seen before in a coalition instructor. Not confidence, not command, concern. A pause. Silence. The chamber remained frozen long after the display ended. And as I left, one thought refused to fade. If that was their training, then what exactly would their war look like? The order came from above, not a suggestion, not an evaluation request, a directive. There was no debate, no alternative interpretation. The coalition had already decided what this moment meant, or rather, what they hoped it meant. A containment chamber was prepared beneath the station's lower deck, larger than any previous testing environment, reinforced with layered adaptive field generators, capable of altering terrain, gravity, atmosphere, and electromagnetic stability in real time. It was not a battlefield. It was a controlled impossibility. And the purpose was simple: to isolate human advantage, to remove adaptation pathways, to force limitation. When I arrived at the observation platform, the chamber below was already active in standby mode. It looked neutral, almost empty. But I knew better. Nothing in that chamber would remain neutral for long. The human stood alone at its center. Corporal Elias Vance, unarmed, unarmored, still. Across from him, the opposing squad assembled. Not a single species this time. A composite unit, selected from the coalition's most effective tactical organisms, each chosen specifically to counter known human strengths.
strength-based species, speed-based species, sensory-enhanced species, predictive cognition specialists, a perfect counterbalance, or so it was believed. The instructor's voice echoed through the chamber. The environment shifted immediately. The ground beneath them fractured into unstable terrain plates, each segment shifting independently. Gravity fluctuated in localized zones. Atmospheric density changed in pulses.
Heat gradients formed and collapsed without warning. There was no stable reference point, no predictable movement, no fixed advantage. It was designed to erase certainty, and for a moment, it worked. The squad moved first, coordinated, efficient, controlled. They did not rush the human. They analyzed him, then advanced. The initial contact was precise, a pressure test, not a strike, a measurement. The human was forced to adjust immediately, stepping back as the terrain beneath him tilted unexpectedly. A minor destabilization, but enough to disrupt stance. The squad reacted instantly. They pressed, not violently, but structurally. They cut off movement vectors, controlled space, denied angles. It was working, at first. From the observation deck, I allowed myself a rare conclusion. Perhaps this time, the system would hold. The human would be contained. Then I noticed something. The human was not reacting defensively. He was observing every shift in terrain, every adjustment in gravity, every movement of the squad, not resisting the system, but mapping it. Then he moved, a single step, not forward, sideways. It seemed insignificant, but the terrain responded. A shifting plate stabilized momentarily beneath him, not by design, by consequence. The squad adjusted. They had to. That adjustment created a gap, small, almost invisible. The human stepped into it, and the pattern began. It was subtle at first, a repositioning here, a feint there, a delay in movement that forced the squad to overcommit. Each action individually meant nothing, but together, they accumulated. I realized what I was seeing. He was not breaking the formation. He was stressing it, applying pressure at the weakest structural points, not enough to collapse it immediately, but enough that collapse became inevitable. The squad attempted recalibration. They shifted tactics, increased coordination, engaged predictive modeling. It did not matter, because every adaptation they made, he had already accounted for. Not faster, not stronger, just earlier, as if he had already seen the outcome and was simply walking through the required steps. One of the squad members lunged. Perfect timing, perfect angle. Under any normal system, it would have been decisive. The human did not block. He did not counter. He stepped aside, and the terrain shifted at that exact moment, not because of him, but because of cumulative instability. The attacker overextended, fell into a collapsing gravity pocket, eliminated by environment, not force. Another followed, then another, not defeated directly, but removed by consequence. The battlefield itself was no longer neutral. It was reacting, not to the squad, but to the human's pattern of movement. I felt something tighten in my perception, because I understood what was happening. The environment was not being controlled, it was being learned, and learning always produces bias. The squad began to falter, not from injury, from uncertainty.
Their coordination degraded by fractions, milliseconds of hesitation, micro-adjustments that no longer aligned. And in that gap, the human expanded, not aggressively, simply consistently, like gravity itself becoming aware of direction. One by one, the squad fell out of synchronization, but the terrain beneath shifted again, and there was nowhere stable left to retreat to. They collapsed. The simulation stabilized, then froze. Silence. The system registered termination, and then reset confirmation. The chamber dimmed. The environment flattened back into neutral state. All adaptive variables returned to baseline. And in the center, the human stood alone, unchanged, uninjured, unremarkable in appearance, and yet completely dominant in outcome. The instructor's voice echoed. No one spoke after that. Not immediately, because there was nothing left to evaluate, no flaw to identify, no advantage to isolate, no correction to apply, only result. I watched the human carefully. He did not look around. He did not acknowledge the outcome. He simply stood there,
as if the simulation had been nothing more than a confirmation of something already known. Then finally he exhaled, slow, controlled, and the slightest shift occurred in his posture. Not exhaustion, not relief, completion. The observation deck remained silent long after the squad was extracted, and I found myself asking a question no one dared voice aloud. Was this ever meant to test him? Or was it meant to show us something we were too late to understand? The report was required. Formal submission, coalition-wide distribution, final classification update. But as I compiled the data, I realized something unsettling. There was no longer anything to classify, only to reinterpret. Every metric we had used to define strength, force output, endurance thresholds, environmental survivability, tactical efficiency, had been exposed as incomplete, not wrong, just irrelevant in the presence of what we had observed. I began with the only statement that still felt structurally true. Humanity is not physically dominant. That fact had not changed. Their bodies remained fragile compared to many coalition species. Their raw biological output still ranked below apex classifications. Their sensory systems were not superior. Their natural defenses were minimal. By all historical standards, they should not be exceptional. And yet, they were. Because the next conclusion no longer belonged to biology, it belonged to philosophy. Strength, as previously defined, is obsolete. I paused after writing that line, because it was not a conclusion I had been instructed to reach, it was one the data forced upon me. Strength in coalition doctrine had always been measured as resistance to external pressure, the ability to endure, to overpower, to outlast.
But humans did not operate within that framework. They operated outside it. They did not ask how much pressure they could endure. They asked how pressure could be altered, how environments could be reshaped, how constraints could be rewritten. I continued the report. Humans represent something new, a species that refuses to accept limitations as fixed. They do not adapt to the universe. They force the universe to adapt to them. As I wrote this sentence, I felt a subtle discomfort, because it was not poetic exaggeration, it was operational truth. Every recorded engagement supported it. The gravity chamber incident, the simulation collapse, the training logs, the iterative adaptation cycles, all pointed to the same conclusion. Humans did not survive conditions. They redefined what survival meant within those conditions. The report continued. The gravity band incident is now classified as a primary case study across multiple coalition divisions, not as a weapon demonstration, but as a paradigm shift in environmental interaction. Training philosophies are already being revised. Adaptive instability environments are being introduced in controlled formats, not to replicate human ability, but to understand it, to study it, to prepare for it. I hesitated before writing the final section, because it was no longer analysis. It was warning. The most dangerous opponent is not the strongest one. That sentence had always been used in tactical theory, but it had never been real, not until now. I continued. It is the one who can change the rules, because strength operates within systems, and systems can be measured, countered, balanced. But rules define the system itself, and humans do not operate within fixed rules. They modify them through exposure, through iteration, through pressure, through refusal to remain static. I ended the report with classification summary. Humanity is not a threat in the traditional sense. They are a redefinition of threat modeling itself. Then finally, I wrote the last line, the one I was not certain I was permitted to include, but could not remove. Do not measure humans by what they are. Measure them by what they refuse to remain. I submitted the report. For a long moment, there was no response, no confirmation, no acknowledgement, only silence across the network. And in that silence, I understood something far more unsettling than any battle I had witnessed. The coalition was not preparing to evaluate humanity. It was preparing to relearn itself because of them. And somewhere beyond that silence, humanity continued its training, unchanged, unstopped, unfinished.